Okay, in this video, I'm going to show you why using sampled drums in a Reason song can be problematic. Okay, I've loaded a drum loop into this NN19 sampler, and I'm going to trigger it from the keyboard right now so you can hear what the loop sounds like. Okay, so it's a 2-bar loop, tempo's 130. So you'll notice that I set my Reason tempo at 130. And I've got two lanes here. We'll talk about lanes in another Reason tutorial. But here's what I did. Basically, on lane 1, which is the lane at the bottom here, what I did was I triggered that Reason loop by holding the key down on the keyboard, and then I just held it down for 16 bars, and the NN19 is set to loop that sample over and over again. So I'm going to play some of it and let's see what it sounds like. You'll notice I've muted lane 2. We'll listen to that in a minute. Okay, so here's lane 1 with the single trigger of this loop, and then I'm just holding the key down. So it seems to be working fine, right? You're probably thinking, well, why don't I just do it that way? What's the problem? Well, do you notice that I stopped here just about the beginning of measure 7? And I'm going to go ahead and hit the play button and notice what happens. No drum loop. That click you're hearing is just the click track. I turned that on so we can use it as a reference. So the problem here, that loop or that sample, it's a sample now, because I loaded in the sample player, is triggered in the first measure, but it's not triggered anywhere else. I just held it. So if I start the Reason song anywhere except for the first measure, I won't hear the drum loop. I'm going to rewind to the beginning and start it. There's the drum loop. But if I stop and then play again, no drum loop. It only gets the trigger to play at the downbeat of the first bar. Okay, so you might be thinking, well, okay, what if I just re-trigger the drums every couple of bars since it's a 2-measure loop? Well, that's what I did in this second lane. I'm going to switch to the edit mode for a minute and we'll take a look at that. You can see that the drums are re-triggered every 2 measures. Okay, and I'm going to leave it in edit mode and I'll hit the play button and you'll see that happening. Okay, so it sounds fine. Does that fix our problem? Well, let's try it. I'm going to start it at measure 1 again, and then I'll stop in the middle of the first 2 bars. Okay, now when I hit play, silence, but it'll pick up again at bar 3, where the sample gets triggered a second time. Okay, so that's definitely a drawback of using sampled drum loops. We want the drums to play when we hit the play button and stop when we hit the stop button. Okay, so how are we going to get around that? Well, we're going to use the Dr. Rex player, but before we go there, let me show you another really significant flaw of doing this. Maybe you say, well, I can get by, I don't care if the drum plays as long as I re-trigger it every couple of bars. What if you decide as you're working on your song, however, that you want to change the tempo? Okay, this loop that I loaded in was recorded at 130 beats per minute, and it plays back pretty well in time with the click track when Reason sequencer is set at 130 beats per minute. But what if I decide later I want my song to be a little slower? I just slowed the tempo down to 120 beats per minute. Okay, and I've left the click track on. The click is going to beat at 120 beats per minute, and let's see what the drums do. It's a real mess, isn't it? The click track is beaten at 120. The drums, again, since they're being played by a sampler doesn't know anything about speeding up or slowing down according to the tempo. The only thing that happens more quickly or more slowly in terms of the sampler is when do we get to these trigger points. That's the only thing that is affected by the change in tempo. The sample that is played is going to play back at its original speed. Again, what happens is by changing the tempo, we get to these trigger points to begin the sample playing either more quickly or more slowly. Let's go up to a tempo of 150. And you'll see it's a similar problem. This time the click track will be going faster than the drum loop. And because of the unequal tempi between the drum loop that's being played by the sampler and the sequence tempo, every time we get to one of these re-trigger points, you hear a hiccup. If I go back to that single triggered lane, remember that where it was just triggering on bar 1, we'll still have the same problem with the click track not being in sync with the drums or vice versa. In this method, we don't get that little hiccup every time the sample is re-triggered because it's only triggered once at the beginning, but because the sequencer is now running at 150 beats per minute, the drums still playing at 130, your drummer will get farther and farther and farther behind all of the other instruments as the song progresses. So that's why we need Rex files. In the next tutorial, I'm going to talk about Rex files, and we'll hear this same example using the Dr. Rex player.